When we talk about white privilege, it's not to say that individual white people don't face issues or challenges to having like a high-paying job or having financial security, healthcare, entrance into college. We're not saying that. We're saying that historically built into institutions that communities of color, because of things like the China's Exclusion Act or slavery or undocumented immigration, have prevented communities of color from getting access to higher education and also access again to these high-paying, secure public sector jobs. But then you have white folks not understanding that because they're white, there's a leg up to getting into colleges and getting higher level degrees and also having access to these public sector jobs. But then you have that white pushback, seeing like, oh, because I'm a woman or because I'm Asian American and maybe I'm underrepresented in the police force, that maybe with affirmative action, the police force would want to recruit me to work there because there are not a lot of people who look like me in that sector. There could be that white pushback like, well, why is she getting in? Like, I could be perfectly qualified, but they'll look at it like, but I'm supposed to get in, not understanding like, you think you're supposed to get in because you're white, and kind of like never being told no. Whereas like people of color, we're aware that we get told no all the time, and it's not right, but we're used to the shit. We're fighting back against it, but we're not unaware that we get told no all the time because of our race or because of our gender or because we might be like disabled. And so white communities are not familiar enough with white privilege to understand that it's not discrimination, it's trying to re-level a playing field that was never level to begin with. And so then we have these conversations about like, well, what is white privilege, what is historical discrimination, and what is like equalizing everything? And it gets complicated quick because a lot of white folks don't want to acknowledge, we're not saying that individual white people don't have access issues. There is major white poverty in this country, but that's not specifically what we're talking about. And we're talking about leveling the playing field for protected groups, which again are women, people of color, and disabled, at least in the state of California. Enrollment of Black, Latino, Native American students at all of our public institutions has gone down, as has promotions for people of color and women in public sectors. It also really damaged contracts. Like I said, let's say the state or some kind of public institution needs a service, whether that's like construction workers, it's video, it's any kind of independent small-owned business, because they're not allowed to put out the call that we're looking for women-owned business or people of color-owned business. It's affected those contracts too. So it's super important to have the information so folks know what it means to have it come back and also know what it is and get informed voters ready to vote to pass ACA 5 in November. In the state of California and all over this country, there's been studies that students of all races do very well with Black male teachers. There is a shortage of Black male teachers. Now, there's not a lot of young Black men going into the teaching profession for any number of reasons. If we pass affirmative action, one of the methods that the state of California would be using would be like specific targeting. So let's say one of the things that they're really worried about, like I said, is we have to go get young Black male teachers. So it means that not only would they be able to have the outreach, be able to call it what it actually is, it also means that there's allocated funds, whether that's going to be from like the state or from other institutions that like want to see that increase. It would be like, cool, we're going to be, say San Jose State is like, hey, you know, we really want to train the best and brightest, you know, Black male teachers for the state of California. It means there would be allocated funds given to them if they're able to increase a certain percentage or turn out a specific number of Black male teachers. So they would actually be able to say that. Maybe they would be able to provide scholarships like, yeah, hey, like we're the leading institution of training Black male teachers for our state, so now we have specific scholarships for this. Where right now, it doesn't mean that there aren't scholarships for Black male teachers, it's just that they're not specifically called that. Like as an example, if you're applying for a job in a public sector right now, you're gonna see that being bilingual is very desirable. And it's like, okay, cool, like that makes sense, but you're not allowed to say bilingual in what language. So you ever gone to like a DMV, or you've been to like the courthouse, or you've interacted with cops, and you'll be like, oh my God, like we're in a super Vietnamese speaking community, or we're in like a very Spanish speaking community. How come no one here, no one that works for this institution, how come no one speaks the language? It's because you can put on the application that you want bilingual people to apply, but you're not allowed to say, because it would be considered discrimination. Specifically, we need a Vietnamese speaker. Specifically, we need a Spanish speaker. Specifically, we need Farsi or Cantonese or any number of languages. So when you bring affirmative action back, it could be like, hey, you're working in SF in Chinatown. It's a very older Chinese community that's Cantonese speaking. So if you're gonna have like, say, cops out there, they should be able to speak Cantonese. Right now, they're not allowed to say, we need you to be Cantonese speaking. They can go try to find it. They can low-key advertise it, but they're prohibited from specifically saying, hey, to be a police officer in this community or to provide social services in this community, you have to speak Cantonese because they're a public agency, and it would be considered discrimination to say we have to have this. It's probably going to get complicated before it gets better, which is probably going to deter people from wanting to vote for it because we haven't had it in like almost a quarter of a century. It's not going to off tops be like in place easy. It's not going to work well right away like anything, but it's about getting it passed so we can make it better. We have to get people to be like activated citizens. I think people want everything to be so perfect right away that people kind of will put it off on someone else. This is gonna go away from the political example, but just to paint the picture. So 2 years ago, the film Crazy Rich Asians came out, and there had not been this all Asian cast of a film in like over 20 years since the Joy Luck Club. And so a lot of people in the Asian American community are like emo pissed off because it's like, I'm not rich, or like, why are they all light skinned, or why are they all this? And there's like a lot of like nitpicking of like being emo pissed off, but that doesn't speak for me. Like, I'm not that Asian. So the film was highly successful, but there also was like a lot of blogs, editorials. There's also a lot of pushback for like the imperfections of the film, which I loved it, but I also don't disagree that it's not, wholly speaking for like the Asian American community or the Asian American experience, but it's a romantic comedy. It wasn't intended to speak for like every single aspect of the Asian community. It's just offering a voice and a perspective that we have not seen in Hollywood. And so I remember getting upset because it was like, okay, cool. So like, I'm not mad that people don't like the film. I'm not mad people feel like the film doesn't speak for me. But the attitude was kind of like, well, because it's not 100% for me, that should never exist. And my thought was like, but that was so highly successful that it had led to more Asian and Asian American actors, actresses, and directors and writers being in front of the camera and behind the camera. So my thing was like, you don't have to like Crazy Rich Asians. You don't have to say it speaks for you. You don't have to feel like it represents who you are as an Asian or Asian American. But by the fact that it was successful and people of all races worldwide supported that film, it opened up the door for more stories that were more inclusive to come out, like The Farewell or The Abominable, because that movie like got off and kind of like reached people, and Hollywood saw like, wow, people of all colors are willing to support Asian faces like in front of the camera. And so I know that's not a political example, but I think it's kind of like similar. It's like, do we want to bitch and complain that not everything is for us in every single aspect? Or are we willing to kind of like make certain compromises, like, cool, maybe affirmative action is not right now everything that you think it needs to be to change institutional racism, but are you willing to pass it and then therefore keep pushing? The two big things that I really hope people will get more information about, we can talk about more later, is ACA4, which would give 17-year-olds the right to vote in the primary if they turn 18 by the election. So I believe if you're 17, I think, is that Generation Z or is that the generation after Generation Z? I get mixed up. I just recently found that I'm a millennial and I didn't know that. If we get 17-year-olds to vote, it's like if you look at a lot of the protests that have been happening around this country since like Ferguson, it was like teenagers specifically, they were starting the protests. So I'm looking at like in all these cities across the country, it's been primarily teenagers that have not only started the protest, but have been keeping it going. That's getting a lot of pushback from older people who feel like 17-year-olds are not mature enough to vote. I 100% disagree. They've been out here leading the protest, leading this rebellion, so I'm totally pro. Let's let them vote. Like, we need them to be voting, which I super support. Again, that's ACA4 in the state of California, and the other one is ACA6, which would give people on parole, it would restore their voting rights. So like, if you don't know, interaction with the cops, end up in jail, end up in prison, come out, you have a case, you're on parole, your voting rights have been stripped. If you are able to stay out of prison and jail and like age off parole in about 7 years, your voting rights are restored. But we know how this kind of like jail prison system works. The state of California is a prison state, so people historically have high rates of recidivism. So it's like, you got off, you got out, okay, cool, you go back in, it extends your parole. So it's keeping particularly Black and brown communities, particularly Black and brown men, from voting. The last thing, it's only barely July, but the last day to register to vote in this election in November is October 19th, 2020. So you have to have it postmarked by October 19th. So not only is it if you are not registered to vote, please do, but also if you had any kind of like legal name change, you got married, you got divorced, for whatever reason you legally changed your name, you have to re-register to vote. And if you had any kind of address change, you have to re-register to vote. So, because they're gonna ask for like your ID or they're gonna mail you a ballot, all those things have to match. So if you're not registered, please re-register. Please register to vote. And if you have to fix your name or your address, you have to re-register. It's not automatic. You have to take that time to re-register, and it has to be postmarked by October 19th. We need people to understand what affirmative action is. So I talk about my age all the time. I'm 35, and I talk about that a lot for two reasons. One being is context, you know what I mean? So when you think about your age, you can think about the things that you've seen in your lifetime. So when Prop 209 came out, I was 11, and I remember specifically like reading about that and talking about it in like history class in like 6th grade. So it's something that I remember, which is one of the reasons I talk about my age a lot. But for people who are much younger, they have never heard of affirmative action, or they don't know much about it because it hasn't existed in our state, again, for almost a quarter of a century. So we're talking about Generation Z, born in the mid-90s. They were born into a state where we didn't have affirmative action. So it would be for us to have conversations to explain what it is and why it matters, and then hope that we get that voter education going and to get a campaign to pass ACA 5.